News when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm John Tucker.
And I'm Karen Moscow.
And Karen, futures are getting a lift on this last trading day, the holiday shortened week, on optimism over trade talks. President Trump says negotiators made, quote, big progress in a meeting with Japanese officials who are seeking to avoid higher levies that he's threatened against U.S. trading partners. Let's get more from Bloomberg Tokyo Bureau Chief Isabel Reynolds.
Japan's negotiator Akazawa, he's been the focus of global attention really because he's been first in the line to try and get a reprieve from these global tariffs. He was preparing for talks with the Commerce Secretary and the Treasury Secretary. While he was on his way to Washington, suddenly Trump announces, I'm going to be part of these negotiations. So that must have been rather a shock for him. It's rather unclear what actually happened in the end, but what seems to have happened, in fact, is that Akazawa went to the White House and had brief talks with Trump ahead of the actual negotiations.
Bloomberg's Isabel Reynolds says the talks did not result in an immediate halt on the tariffs, but preparations are underway for a second round of talks to take place later this month.
Well, John, Chinese President Xi Jinping is making a diplomatic push to counter U.S. pressure on nations to limit trade ties with Beijing. He is wrapping up a three-nation tour of Southeast Asia, and Xi promoted the idea of a, quote, Asian family and called for regional unity.
And Goldman Sachs says U.S. investors could be forced to offload up to $800 billion in Chinese stocks in a worst-case financial decoupling with China. In the same scenario, Chinese investors might need to unload their U.S. financial assets, which could amount to $1.7 trillion. And Carlyle Group CEO Harvey Schwartz says that global economic growth relies on the two countries finding a way to work together.
I don't think it's a good outcome if the number one and two largest economies in the world haven't found an equilibrium around cooperation. It's really critical for the global economy and for trade that we and China find a place of cooperation and an equilibrium. And I think the faster that can happen, the better it is for all business activity globally, especially in the United States.
Carlyle Group CEO Schwartz was speaking to Sonali Basak for Bloomberg Originals' upcoming series Bullish.
Well, John, we turn to the markets now, and futures are higher following yesterday's sell-off on Wall Street. The S&P 500 dropped 2.25%, and the Nasdaq fell 3% after Fed Chair Jay Powell said trade tensions risk undermining the Fed's employment and inflation goals. Powell spoke at the Economic Club of Chicago.
The level of tariff increases announced so far is significantly larger than anticipated, and the same is likely to be true of the economic effects, which will include higher inflation and slower growth.
Powell's remarks, heard live here on Bloomberg, reinforce a message he has repeatedly emphasized. Fed officials are in no hurry to change the central bank's benchmark policy rate. The Fed next decides on May 7th. And finally, John, Harvard University's refusal to comply with the Trump administration deal to require it to reform its governance and diversity programs is resulting in retribution. The administration's freezing funding of $2.2 billion of multi-year grants, accusing Harvard of mishandling anti-Semitism on campus. President Trump said the school should lose its tax-exempt status, and several outlets reported that the IRS is considering the issue. But Larry Summers, former U.S. Treasury Secretary and former president at Harvard, tells Bloomberg the university needed to push back on the administration's requests.
Harvard should not go interjecting itself into politics. But God, when it is the object of an extra legal set of orders and threats, I don't think it had any viable choice at all but to respond strongly.
And former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers also told Bloomberg that President Trump's actions toward Harvard are part of an effort to suppress institutions that challenge his administration. You can catch David Weston's full conversation with Summers on the Bloomberg podcast page on YouTube. And that's news when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Karen Moscow.
I'm John Tucker, and this is Bloomberg.